Welcome to Halfway There. I'm Eric Nevins, and this is the show where we have honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. My guest today is a speaker, a trainer. He used to be a pastor, and he's got a lot of interesting things to say to us today. I am excited to welcome Ken Roberts to the show. Hi, Ken.
Hey, Eric. Hey, thanks. I'm looking forward as well. Appreciate the invitation to your podcast. Thanks, man.
Yeah, welcome to Halfway There. We connected through a good friend, and why don't you just tell us a little bit about how or where you are in life now, what God's doing with you, and then we'll go back and work our way through your story.
Okay. Yeah, right now I live in Avon Lake, which is on the west side of Cleveland, Ohio. I moved back here about a year and a half ago from Maple Grove, Minnesota. And really what I'm doing right now is I transitioned from being a full-time pastor for 33 years. I was a senior pastor in two different locations over those times, and really moved into, what many people call convergence. And so now I really have the privilege of traveling and doing some speaking. I do quite a bit of training with leaders. I've had a chance to write 2 books, and I'm working on some other books right now. And then I've had the chance to do some coaching. So, really, Eric, it's just a season of my life. I'm 61 years of age as we do this podcast, just turned 61, where really I'm able to live and to lead out of the sweet spot of my life. So it's a great time, great season. Married, my wife, Missy, we've been married 10 years. Just came by that anniversary.
Wow.
And we have 3 kids, and I have 1 grandson, and we're in a very special time of life.
Oh, that's great. I love to hear that you feel like you're in your sweet spot. That is, it's unusual. Not everybody has that opportunity.
J. Robert Clinton, in his book, you may be familiar with it, The Making of a Leader, prophet out of Fuller many years ago. I think he says that less than 20% of leaders ever make it to their sweet spot. So, make it to convergence. So I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah.
But it's been a journey, as your podcast, name states. It's been a journey in getting here.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we want to talk about. So tell us a little bit about, take us back to your growing up years, and then I want to know how you came to Christ.
Okay. My parents grew up in a religious home. They were from Missouri. When they got married, they got away from the Lord. My dad moved from Missouri to Michigan, and long story short, my dad returned, to his experience with the Lord, and also got involved in a church there that was really having I would say a true revival, a little church in a place called Niles, Michigan. My dad was a musician, and so he started traveling with a quartet, and they would go in Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and sing, and on Sunday nights and those things. Well, my dad began to feel he was getting wanted to call into ministry full time. So at the age of 6, we moved to Savannah, Tennessee. My dad took his first church. So pretty much all my life, since my age of 6, I grew up in a pastor's home. For me, that was a very positive experience. I'm in the middle of 7 kids. We're all musical, so we travel with my dad. What I saw my dad speak on Sunday morning, that's who he was on Monday afternoon, so it was just a very authentic life for me. I made a commitment to Jesus Christ at the age of 7. I still remember it. That's 54 years ago. It was on a Sunday night in my dad's little church, that little church there in Savannah, Tennessee. Sunday night, I raised my hand, went down front, made a commitment to Jesus Christ. And, really, Eric, that's 54 years ago, and I've been on that path ever since. I would say I've really never wavered. I've never had any major detours. I've tried to be, faithful in that journey. And so that's kind of my growing up years, and that's how I came to Christ.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so tell us about some of your kind of early learning experiences about the Lord. When did Christ really become personal for you?
That's a great question. Well, I would say from early on when I accepted Christ, I've always had a authentic relationship, an intimate relationship with Jesus Christ. I felt a call into ministry 3 days before my 17th birthday. I still remember that. I was at a youth retreat of our denomination. There was about 3,000 young adults there. And I remember I was sitting up in the balcony with some of my friends and felt, really it's just a tug in my heart that I wanted to give my life, to Christ for full-time service, probably through the life of the church. And so that's kind of was my initial experience with that. But, I've always been involved in ministry. Like I said, I in our youth group, we used to travel with a drama show. I was kind of seen as the leader. I would communicate. I would give a response to salvation at the end. I was always involved in worship. So I've had I would say a true life, intimate relationship with Jesus Christ for a long time. It was not religious, although there were always some religious components of it. But I would say it was an authentic faith in my life from the beginning.
What did that look like? Like, if you had to describe it, what would we like? How would we experience it?
Well, for me, this was the 60s and 70s. That's in my earlier days. For me, it was, I think I had ongoing devotions, of in the Word. I tried to live my life that was true to the commands of the Word. So, I lived a moral life. I had a life of worship. I had a life of, I would say, service to others. I had a life of appreciating the spiritual community or the local church I was part of. I had a life of loving to hear testimonies of missionaries come through, and oftentimes they would stay with us, stay in our home, and hear their journey and their life of faith and miracles that they'd experienced and those type of things. Sharing my faith was a fairly common thing, in school and high school.
Yeah.
So that was my life. I would say it was not heavily duty driven wrongly, but that was the way I expressed it. It was kind of how it was known to be expressed at the time.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you were very sincere and you lived Christianly, I think is how you put it, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Okay. Well, so you felt called to ministry. Where did that lead you?
Originally, I ended up, after I went to seminary, I went to Bible college and went in seminary. And then after that, I ended up coming to Cleveland here through a church plant that was happening. It was happening through the Catholic Charismatic Renewal was happening here in the 80s in Cleveland. Cleveland is a large Catholic area. And I was here and I helped a guy plant a church. And I ended up being on the staff there for 5 years. And then we were doing a lot of church planting. And after 5 years, we sent the senior guy out to plan another work. And I became the senior leader. So I ended up leading this church. It was called North Coast Church here in Cleveland, Ohio. And I was here for 25 years. Okay,
so you're involved in ministry. You're being a pastor. Because I've heard that it can be really challenging to be a pastor.
Right.
Was that your experience?
Well, again, it was overall, it was a very, very positive experience. It was a church that had grown a lot. It was a church that was really on an upward growth curve. A lot of people coming to know the Lord. A lot of young people. We were all fairly young. We were really built on a discipleship model, on a community model, a relationship model. So that was overall, I would say, it was a great experience. It had its challenges, like any leadership does, and you get discouraged at times. But for me, what happened, and we talked about this a little bit, but for me, what happened is I would say that I hit the wall. I came to my come to Jesus moment, I would say, in my mid 40s. I had been leading for a while. Things had been going well. The church was kind of well known in the area. Everything was positive. And then I began to have my own kind of personal crisis of faith, asking some serious questions. And here's the questions I started asking. I felt like there was a growing gap between the reality in my inner life and the responsibilities that I was being asked to do externally. And so I began to kind of have a crisis of faith, you might say, in that way, to say, really, who am I becoming? I began asking the serious question: what are we as a church really producing? Are we really producing, followers of Jesus Christ? And so that kind of became the moment for me when I began to realize, I got to a place where I didn't want to go to church anymore, even though I was
Mm.
leading it. I didn't want to be involved in a long worship service. I just there was a gap between what was happening in my heart and what my external responsibilities were, as a pastor.
Yeah. So I'm curious, like, what do you attribute that to?
I think for me, it was a couple different things. I think I had some relational disappointments, some relationships that had once been close, that division came in. So there was discouragement, disappointments in that area. Our church had been involved in 2 or 3 major revivals where we had really seen a lot of things happen. But I always said there's a downside to the upside of a revival. And the downside is you can't stay there forever. And so when you get on the backside of a move of God or a revival, and I began to really have some real disappointments regarding what we were really building, what we were really producing as a local church. I think you have disappointments as leaders. You expect things to go in a certain direction. You expect certain people to do certain things that they end up not doing. You do have some, sometimes there's criticism, there's expectations you can't fulfill. And for me, it was more just an accumulation of those. And that's usually what happens with leaders. It was not like just one event.
Mm.
It may have been one event that, as they say, broke the camel's back. But usually it's an accumulation of discouragement, disappointment, relational tension, criticisms, expectations that can't be fulfilled, people having their own, pulling you in a lot of different directions. And then that kind of can build up to there's a point where you do feel like you're having a crisis of faith. And that's really what happened to me. So it was no one event, but it was an accumulation of several.
No, I think that's really interesting. It makes me think of how toxins from foods or different things that you eat can build up in the body, right?
You're
and
right.
that can happen to you spiritually as well. Sounds like that was your experience.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah. And then, okay. So, I mean, that's pretty significant. If you're a pastor and you don't want to go to the worship service, you're probably responsible for planning the worship service.
Right. Leading it.
Right. Okay. Right. What'd you do with that?
Well, I was fortunate enough that I tripped into some spiritual disciplines that were at the time were not a part of my Christian upbringing. I was raised in a classic Pentecostal denomination, and and so prayer and fasting and meditation on the Word, and prayer and fasting and worship and meditation on the Word. I mean, those were pretty usual staples of our spiritual disciplines. But during that season of my life, I stumbled into some of the classic spiritual disciplines that I was not that familiar with at the time. Things like simplicity, solitude, silence, meditation. And what I begin to find for me, I call it this way: I begin to find a new or a fresh spiritual well, in classic spiritual disciplines that have been historic in the life of the church. So what was happening with me is that's where I was being fed. I was being fed in those areas. I was doing a little bit more work in my inner life, and so that's really how I dealt with that.
Yeah. Well, okay. I want to talk about that a little bit because I think that's really fascinating. So you discovered these classic spiritual disciplines. How did you discover them?
Well, I had read Richard Foster's spiritual disciplines from way back in college. I was becoming familiar with Dallas Willard and a lot of Dallas Willard's writings at the time. So that was another source that I began to move into. And from there, I just kind of started, pursuing different ones that would be referred to me, and I would begin to read them and begin to meditate on them. So that's kind of how it happened with me.
Sure. Yeah, which is so awesome because I had the same experience. Richard Foster is really how I discovered some of those things. And, I've found silence. There's a silent retreat center here in Colorado, like 20 minutes from our house. It's the best place on earth as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Because there's no responsibility. Nobody expects anything from you. And that's so unusual in our our world.
Right.
Did you so was it stuff like that was valuable to you? Or I'm just really curious because I think there's a lot of people, who are in a similar spot, right? Where what they've been told is read the Bible and pray. And this sort of spiritual discipline stuff, as you say, that's historical and been used by the church for literally thousands of years. It feels kind of woo woo, and so
right.
I'm wondering, like, how do you just take us into that experience and why it's not woo woo?
Well, of course, you're very familiar with, and probably a lot of your listeners are, with the material on the critical journey, and
yes.
that I know you've used it and referenced it before. And generally, through stage 3, we have systems that help us get in our spiritual growth there. So we have pastors in our life, we have teachers in our life, we have structures in our life, we have church meetings in our life, we have ways to approach God in our life, that have really worked for us and have brought us to a certain possibly place in our spiritual journey. But then when we hit this wall. However we hit this wall, we can hit it in lots of different ways. But when we hit this wall, usually those particular types of structures or disciplines won't get us to where we need to go next. And so that's kind of what I experienced. And again, that's why spiritual disciplines to me became a new fresh well that helped me to navigate through the wall. And here's why I think that is. Here, I can give you some thoughts on why I think that is.
Yeah.
Of course, I think silence and solitude is Ruth Haley Barton, in one of her books, makes it a great. She says that silence and solitude, they let what's happening in your soul surface. So if you're dealing with disappointment, if you're dealing with confusion, if you're dealing with a life crisis or a faith crisis, solitude and silence allows your soul to surface. It's like an animal won't come out unless you're quiet. Our soul's the same way.
Mm.
And so that helped me in a lot just by silence and solitude. I didn't have to keep up the pace all the time. I could really, say, God, what is happening in me? What is this I'm feeling? Why do I feel a disconnect of the spiritual, conduits that I've used to be in? So I think that's one thing that helped me just in silence. And then the other thing is, I think, you're able to engage with God in a new way.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, these things take you into your own personal, intimate relationship with Jesus that isn't predicated upon somebody else doing it for you or it being defined by how everybody else thinks it should be. It takes you, I think, into a more understanding of, again, our union we have with him, how we engage with God, how we have this ongoing, authentic journey with Jesus. And so it begins to kind of shed some of the scaffolding we built up to that point. And I just think it takes you to a more intimate and authentic relationship with Jesus Christ. So you almost have to unlearn some things, mm-hmm. I find. And you also, I find I'm more settled with mysteries than I used to be. I don't try to find an answer for everything or put everything that I'm experiencing in one little box. So I think it opens me up. It has opened me up more to the ebb and flow of my relationship with Jesus Christ and some things that are mysteries. They're mysteries to life, or mysteries to my faith, or mysteries to things I don't understand. Sometimes I don't have a concrete answer for everything. I don't feel like I need to have that answer anymore. So I think spiritual disciplines really help you to go build a more intimate life in your inner life, with your relationship with Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Ken, I could not have given a better description of growing in spiritual maturity than what you just did. I love that. I think what you said about, hey, sometimes we outgrow these things, and what got us where we're going isn't what got us here.
Yeah.
And
very, very true.
yeah, it's interesting to think about that from a spiritual perspective. Sometimes we think about that with leadership or business maybe, but to think about that from a spiritual perspective, that there's a time when we outgrow what we actually used to do, and we need to open ourselves up to what God wants to do next. That's awesome.
And I think because there isn't a lot of teaching on that, then it makes people really feel confused. They're not aware of that. Maybe they don't have people in their lives to kind of take them through that process. They feel like, what's wrong with me? Or maybe even the church system feels a little bit threatened when a person gets to that point. And so I think even with what you're doing with the podcast here, just kind of that conversation, everybody goes through this in some season of their life, and usually more than once.
Yeah.
And it can either take you into a much deeper, intimate, authentic relationship in your spiritual journey, or it can take you down other paths. But if you understand that it's something that you will experience, you will hit these detours or these walls in your journey. But if you find ways to move through them, they will take you to a much deeper place, in a much greater place of wholeness and healing in your own life.
Yeah. It's hard because you can't do these things in mass. It's a lot easier to teach people, in like a big class or a sermon, and give them some knowledge and ask them to do something or go work on the nursery or whatever it is, than it is to actually walk with somebody who's having these kinds of questions or needs somebody to teach them how to be quiet or how to, pray imaginatively, things like that. It's hard to do with a lot of people.
I totally agree. Yeah, and I think it's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's that, certain structures get people to a certain place which are needed. But again, once they have to move beyond that, we're not really that good at helping them understand how to do that and to move into, stage 4, the next phase of their spiritual journey.
Mm-hmm.
So it happened to me as a pastor, which is kind of, somewhat, I guess, unusual, or maybe not unusual, but I just began to realize I was 46, 47 years of age at the time. And I just began to realize, I would say, looking back, I realized I had 3 options at the time. This is important. I had 3 options at the time. The one option was to continue to do what I was doing in the way that I was doing, and let the gap between my inner life and my outer responsibilities continue to grow. That's what I would call becoming more and more religious. Meaning there's a disconnect between what we're doing, what we're saying, what we're confessing, how we're acting, how we're performing. There's a disconnect between that outward appearance and really the authenticity of what's happening in our life. And a lot of people and a lot of leaders, they get involved. That becomes one of the paths they go down, is they just kind of still play the game, try to do whatever they're doing, and try to stay out of trouble, and just try to, hope they can make it to retirement and keep picking up their check until then. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that a lot of times you don't know what else to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but you do feel that there's a disconnect between what's happening in you and what you're being expected to put out. So that's one that often happens, that I realized was a possibility of the detour in the road for me back then at the age of 47. And the second one is that's how people get in the ditch. That's how leaders get in trouble. I think, when we hit a wall, temptation is stronger in our life. When we hit a wall, cracks that are already there become, larger cracks. I call it, when we're trying to find something to jumpstart our soul. Our soul is, feeling somewhat dead. Our soul is feeling somewhat out of equilibrium, and oftentimes we get in trouble by trying to find something that will jumpstart our soul. And I think that's where, again, people and leaders, they often get in trouble. It's amazing how that temptation seems to be so strong in our mid 40s. And then the third path is really a path, it's straight ahead that we just talked about. The third path is getting someone to help you work through your wall so that on the other side of it, you have a deeper, more whole, healthier, authentic journey and relationship with Jesus Christ. And that's really when we're made. I mean, our life message, the essence of who we are, happens by us moving through these times of crisis and coming out on the other side. That's really it's a greater place of greater maturity and greater health and greater wholeness.
Yeah. Now I think I know, but I'm guessing you chose the last one.
Yeah, I did. I was fortunate enough at the time. I didn't exactly know that's what was happening, but that has led me now to, that's why I'm now in convergence that we talked about earlier. That's why I feel like that I'm living and leading out of my sweet spot, because for the wall helps you do a couple different things. It helps you shed things of your past container that's not helpful for your next season of life. So you got to work through those things, what they are. It definitely deepens, I think, an authentic relationship with Jesus Christ. You're walking in a deeper way than you've ever done. Third, I think it really helps you clarify who you are. Who is Ken Roberts? And your wall, when you go through difficult times and you work through it, it helps you further define, this is who I am. This is not who I am. This is the essence of how I'm made. And then I think the other thing it does, it really helps you clarify what your purpose is. Instead of doing 10 things, really, what am I designed to do? And so, yeah, I would say looking back, that has staying on that path and going through those things has taken me to a deeper place. And I'd have to say to you, I think that's one reason that I'm living out of convergence, is because I was able to make it through that phase or that stage in life. Now, the other thing occurred that you're aware of, but we haven't talked about yet, that was in the year 2000. So again, I was 46, 47 at the time. And then just a couple years later, my late wife was killed in a car accident. So it was on a Tuesday morning. We had gotten up to have our devotions and went downstairs, had a cup of coffee, had a conversation about the week, and the schedule, and who's coming over when, what do we have to do on Thursday night, what's Wednesday night look like, where the kids have to be Friday afternoon, and just did our normal stuff. Went upstairs, kissed each other, said goodbye. She went to drop my daughter off at our office where she worked, and then she was going to go to a women's Bible study. I went to work out, got finished working out, was on my way home, got a phone call from my daughter, and my daughter said, "Hey, Dad, the hospital's calling for you." And she said, "Mom's has had an accident," and we had no idea if it was, a little fender bender. She was checking out her neck, make sure she didn't have, she had a broken arm. Had no idea. Got to the hospital, and my wife of 25 years, at the age of 47, was laying in front of me in a coma. And she had a brain aneurysm, went to a red light. Young man hit her in the driver's side. She'd hit her head on the windshield, brain trauma, and she died 3 days later. Mm. So I'm saying that for a couple things, is that I was already on this journey into a deeper inner life 3 years before my wife's accident occurred. And that led me then through this greatest crisis I'd ever had in my life. And it led me through, and I began to realize that God didn't cause this, but that God will use all things to conform us into the image of his Son. And I began to navigate that crisis in my life of losing my wife, that somehow if I would embrace God in it, and embrace this now as a part of my life, as a season of my life, that he would use it to shape me more and more into the image of his Son, like nothing else I'd ever experienced. So my inner life journey, my going through the wall, my finding a depth in God that I never experienced before, my, embracing the mysteries of life, me figuring out who I really am, what I'm really called to do, how I really want to live my life, they all came out as a result of moving through that tragedy in my life, and then led me to the journey that I'm on and have been on, ever since then. That was in 2014.
Wow.
That was in 2004. I'm sorry, 2004.
Okay. Yeah. It sounds like what I'm thinking while I'm listening to you is like you said, you were already on that journey, and then your wife passes away suddenly. This is a very dangerous time for you, right? You could have gone a lot of different directions that weren't healthy.
Extremely dangerous. One other ingredient in the whole thing is 9 months before my wife was killed in a car accident, our church, which was a large church, had just built our first building, 1,500 seat auditorium, 36 acre campus, $10 million project. And we got in the building and we began to have difficulty, with a large mortgage and those type of things. And we were only in there 9 months when my wife's accident occurred. So the combination of me having questions regarding my own leadership and what we were reproducing and what was the church world really like. Third, having the pressure of a large facility now that I was responsible for. And then, third, my wife being killed in a car accident. You put all those together, and yes, I was in a very, very vulnerable place at the time.
Wow. So how did you navigate that? How did you choose to go in a direction of depth and openness with God instead of anger? Or maybe you did go through that. I don't know.
Yeah, I went through some of the stages, but I would say not a lot. Eric, all I can say to you is that, it's hard for me to explain it now, but
sure.
I think all I can say is that somehow, again, I knew on the front end of this that this would be the most life-shaping experience I'd ever gone through.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a commitment on the front end that I wanted to embrace it and embrace God in it, so that when I got out on the other side of it, however long this valley of the shadow of death would last, however long I'd have to walk through this valley, I didn't know. But I made a commitment that once I got out to the other side of it, I wanted to be better for it and not worse for it. I wanted to become more like Jesus and not more bitter. I wanted to become, deeper in my walk with him and not more shallow, etc. So I think that had a lot to do with it, is just where my mind was at.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is going to shape me. And how is it going to shape me? Will it shape me for the better, or will it shape me for the worst? And I think that grid really helped me move through it. Again, I was involved with spiritual disciplines. They helped a lot. I was involved with, a good group of men. It was an accountability group, that we met together and we talked about our hearts together and we talked about our future together, so I had a good community around me. But, I experienced a new side of grace that I had never known, grace in my weakness, grace in God carrying me, grace when I was not strong, grace when things seemed to be falling apart around me. And again, just a new intimacy with the Father as I walk through this thing.
Yeah, I love that. I think you're right. That commitment to, I'm going to make sure that this draws me closer to God, not away from God, is huge.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, shaping for sure. Wow. Okay. Well, so you eventually left, I don't know if it was that church, you eventually moved into what you're doing now. Can you connect those two pieces?
Yeah, so when my wife was killed in a car accident, and like I said, we had just moved to a large facility, so I felt that I needed to stay there. So I stayed there for another 3 years as a senior pastor, and I was a widower for 3.5 years. And then God graciously brought, a relationship into my life, and we had been married, like I said earlier, 10 years, just past our 10-year mark. Once we got engaged and got married, we were still living here in Cleveland. And then I made a decision once I got married to resign that church as a senior pastor, and ended up ended up in Maple Grove, Minnesota, leading a church there, and was there for 8 years. It was a great time for us. It was a time for me to, refocus how I wanted to lead a church, refocus the values I wanted to put in a spiritual community. It was a time for me and my wife, her name is Missy, for Missy and I to, just rebuild our own life. So we were away. We weren't around any family. It was kind of our own time of rebuilding, and had a great 8 years there. And then I can tell you what happened for me. About 3 years ago, I began to feel that stirring, that unsettledness, like that there was something next for me. And I wasn't exactly sure what it was, but I knew a change was coming. And then over time, as I kind of processed that, we ended up moving back here to Cleveland. We've been back here about 1.5 years now. And really, we did that for two different reasons. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. One, I had a grandson that was just born, and we wanted to be back to family. We've been away from family for a long time. Most of my wife's family lives here in the area. And so I was just thinking about the next, 10, 15, 20 years of my life. And I'm just saying, I don't want to be away from home. I want to be close to my family. So we moved back for that reason. But we wouldn't have moved back for that reason alone. The second reason we moved back is what I talked about earlier, is I knew I was on the front end of convergence in my life and leadership. And I knew that for my next 10 to 15 years of my, leadership life, my ministry life, that I really needed to more narrowly focus what I was supposed to do. So I'd been a senior pastor for a long time. Those had been fruitful years. But I was asking myself, what am I passionate about? What do I want to give my time, effort, and energy about for the next 10, 15 years of my life? And so really, for me, it's come down to three things. The first one, so here's what I say. Here's the three nails I want to hit for the rest of my life. Here's the three nails I want to pound for the rest of my life. The first one is really helping individuals and also local churches in the whole area of really what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. This whole thing about discipleship, and we all know we're supposed to become more like Jesus. We all know we're supposed to grow in the nature of Christ. I mean, we hear that, it's taught. That's foundational in our Christian faith. But my big question has been for the last probably 15 to 20 years, has been, okay, how do we do this? Okay, we know we're supposed to do it, but how do we do it? I've always been a practitioner asking the question, okay, we're supposed to do it, how we do it. So that's one of the areas I focus on, and just trying to, help people get unstuck in their spiritual journey, help people really define for them what it really means to be a follower of Jesus, help people in a very practical way. How do I become more like Jesus Christ? What's the templates and the tools to do that? So that's the first nail. The second one then is what we talked about earlier, because of my own leadership journey, my own life journey. I want to help pastors and Christian leaders. Here's the way I say it: live well while they lead well. So my focus there is helping leaders live from the inside out, focus on their inner life so that they're healthy and whole, and they're also growing. And so I call it the living well while you lead well. And then really my third area, third nail I want to hit is helping followers of Jesus focus their life so they can live a fruitful life. I personally believe that, Christians should be the most fruitful people on the planet, but I'm not sure that we are. And so, trying to help, how do we focus our life so that we can live a purposeful life, so we can live a productive life, so we can live a fruitful life. So the thing that's so freeing about that, Eric, at this season of my life, like I said, I just turned 61, is I really know who I am, and I really know what I'm, called to do. And therefore, I made the move back to Cleveland so I could really focus on that, be with family, and really live out of my season of convergence in my life and as a leader.
Yeah. So you know who you are and who you're not.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say again, full loop on this. What brought me there is going through the walls that we talked about earlier, going through those seasons where you know something's not right internally. You know that, there's a gap happening, going through life crisis, faith crisis, and being able to go through them brings you then, I think, to a place of greater health, greater wholeness, greater clarity on who you are, and greater clarity on what you're called to do.
Yeah. So if somebody's feeling that sense of gap, as you call it, what should they do? What's the step they should take in order to address that?
Well, I would say, without this sound like it's self-promotion, because it's not. The first thing I would say to somebody is to find either a good coach that's been through this, or find a spiritual director that's been through this, that can help you ask the right questions, read the right material, process the right things, because it's very difficult to do it on your own. I mean, I graciously, I guess I would say, I did not have that in my life at the time. I found all this great material. I kind of got involved in a community that was more aware of these inner life things. But the first thing I would say to somebody, if you're really serious about trying to make it through these things or figure these things out, get somebody in your life who's been there, done that. They know the journey, and they can lead you along the path. It would save a lot of people a lot of time, effort, pain, confusion, detours, by simply finding somebody who's a great spiritual coach, and also, or somebody who's a spiritual director.
Yeah.
But I would only get somebody who not simply knows these concepts, but somebody who has gone through them and they're on the other side. So they know the concepts, but they've also experienced the concepts, but they have the fruitfulness to communicate the concepts. And so I would follow somebody who's already been through the journey. And that's not a plug for, what I do. That's just the reality, is what I would say. It would help a lot of people.
Well, I think you're right. And so the point I want to make about that is, start at your church. You may not find it there. The reality is, especially if you're evangelical, most evangelicals don't really have a concept of spiritual direction.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Yep.
And if that's true, then look around. And so, I appreciate your hesitance to not promote yourself, but I do want to do that because you are a coach, and so people could connect with you. I'll put a link in the show notes. People can find that at halfwaytherepodcast.com. Click the show notes for this page, and I'll link over to you. That's an easy way to do it.
Okay.
But you're right. There are people out there like yourself, or just Google spiritual direction in your area. You may have to go outside of your normal denomination. The spot I mentioned earlier in Sedalia is called the Jesuit or Sacred Heart Jesuit Retreat House. They've got spiritual directors there. A lot of my audience is here in Colorado, some around the country and world. But you may have to go outside of your normal tradition, and you might grow that way as well.
Yeah. Let me offer three resources there that I'm connected to directly. One is, I wrote a book. I stumbled into it after my late wife's passing, called Unexpected: Navigating Life's Unforeseen Turns. And so that little book, it's a book, 140 pages or whatever, has helped, Eric, really literally thousands of people navigate through times of just uncertainty, unexpected seasons in their life. It doesn't have to be a tragedy as dramatic as mine was. It could be a divorce. It could be a sickness. It could be losing a spouse. But so that little book's been very helpful. Unexpected: Navigating Life's Unforeseen Turns. The second one that I would say for leaders, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Staying Power: 5 Core Ideas to Sustainability in Christian Leadership. And it's really my journey, but I list 5 things that are core, I think, for a leader to remain healthy over the long haul. My story's in there, my journey's in there, some of the things we talked about's in there. But again, that book has helped literally thousands of pastors and church leaders to consider their inner life, to consider where they're at, to consider, how can I do this over the long haul? And then the third resource is a resource that actually is just coming out. It'll be out in January, but I'm doing a life focus online coaching course.
Oh, cool.
And that's to help people really do, focus their life so they can live a fruitful life. So those are some things that are connected to this conversation we've had. And if I could serve people, help them any way, I'd be honored to do that.
Awesome. Okay, well, send me a link over for that
Will do.
when you have it, and I'll put that in the show notes at halfwaytherepodcast.com.
Okay.
Great. What's next for you? Where's God leading you think?
I've been at this now, I made this transition for a year and a half. As we do this podcast right now, it's the end of 2017, moving into 2018. So, I'm thinking about that. But really, I believe that these three areas of focus that I talked about is what I want to remain focused on. And I think they're going to continue to deepen. Hopefully, they'll continue to deepen in my own life. They'll continue to deepen in the content. And I think they'll continue to expand, to help others. So if you were to ask me what's next for me, I hope to continue to be, someone who's speaking, training, writing, and coaching, and helping people in those three areas that I just mentioned. I really do think that's next for me. And again, I'm grateful that I feel like I'm in a great season of life.
Oh, I love that. Ken, thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks, Eric. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Bless you, man.
Yeah. Friends, you can get all the links that we talked about with Ken, his books, and some of the other books that we mentioned are all linked at halfwaytherepodcast.com. Go check that out, and we'll see you over there.